Welcome to the Becoming Whole podcast, where we help men, women, and families learn and live God's good, holy, and beautiful design for sexuality. I'm your host, Josh Glazer, and we're glad you're here. You ready? Let's dive in. In my nearly 20 years of walking with men and women who are wrestling with sexual issues, some of the most painful stories I've heard are from men and women who have been sexually abused. And one of the reasons it's so painful is because of the way that sexual abusers will groom and manipulate those they abuse to believe something about themselves that isn't true. And while I think that most of us feel that same sense of sadness and sympathy for those who have been groomed and manipulated in that way, we miss some of the similarities between that and the way that the enemy of our souls has actually manipulated and groomed us to believe things that are not true about ourselves. And he does this for the same reasons, because he wants to trap us. He wants to get us stuck in the prison of his own making. Because if we don't believe what's true about ourselves and instead believe something that's false about ourselves, then we are that much more likely to live into the faulty narrative that he's trying to get us to believe. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's go back to the illustration of what happens when somebody is groomed and manipulated by a sexual abuser. What that person is trying to get their victim to believe includes things like they wanted this. This is something that they invited or they caused to happen. And we can hear in these words just how horrific, how awful, how abusive even these ideas are. I mean, this is part of why abuse is so damaging to the human heart, the human soul, the human body. And the enemy of our souls doesn't just use that tactic in the area of sexual abuse. He uses that tactic all over the place. So specifically, if you wrestle with ongoing, habitual, unwanted sexual behaviors, what are the ways that you've believed lies about yourself that are similar, that are akin to these kinds of lies? One of the areas that I've seen over and over again is how the enemy tries to get those who are addicted to sexual behaviors or those who experience certain types of sexual attractions to believe something about their identity, that this, in fact, is not something that they have been struggling with. This isn't not something that's present in their life. This is something about who they are. This is a fact about their identity. And it goes down to the root of their personality, the root of who they are. And this is so destructive because if the enemy can get me to believe, for example, that I'm wired, that it's just a part of my DNA to lust after women, to take advantage of them in that way, then there's no hope. I'm not going to be able to carry hope around in me that I'll be able to really overcome that struggle and live differently. And this is, you've heard me talk about this before. This is a lie in our culture. I mean, there are men who live, and whether they articulate it or not, or think it consciously or not, somewhere deep inside, they believe about themselves that this is just what men are. Not just what they do, but what men are. We lust after women. If there's a woman in front of me and she's not wearing much, then I'm going to look at her lustfully, and you can't expect me to do otherwise. And in the age of the Me Too movement, this kind of thinking is being called out, but it nonetheless persists among men as a kind of this subtle under the radar lie that a lot of us believe, including Christian men. Other areas where we see this today rampantly certainly include in the LGBT community, men and women who are who experience same-sex attraction, who don't just use the term gay as kind of a descriptor describing themselves as gay because it's a shorthand way of saying I have same-sex attractions, but who actually believe in the kind of in the fabric of their being that this is who they are, that this is an intractable reality of who they are that cannot be changed, that is as true about them as anything is true about them, and who come in turn then to see their whole world through the lens of being gay. I was talking to somebody recently who was describing their own kind of artistic nature, their own love of music, their own sensitivities, and who said, this is all a part of me because I'm gay. And I challenged him. I said, is it possible that God made you artistic and sensitive and a lover of music and that it has nothing to do with with being gay. It has something to do with just who God has designed you to be, and that you share that in common with other people who are artistic and sensitive and who love music. And it was kind of a paradigm shift for this person. Like, I always assumed, especially as a man, that this was a part of me being gay. And so my point is, for this person, he had become so kind of wrapped up in the idea that being gay was an identity, a core identity for him, that this other aspect of his personality got looped into that, as opposed to this other part of his personality is just a part of being a human being created in God's image and having nothing to do with his sexuality. And listen, this is not about me trying to be the word police, telling people how they should describe themselves or what they should think about themselves. It really is just trying to get after how important it is that we never come underneath a lie about our identity, that we never come underneath a smaller identity than the one that God has created for us. And I think that there are lots and lots of ways that the enemy will try to get us to kind of back ourselves into a corner or come into a smaller world view of ourselves, a smaller impression of ourselves, a more destructive impression of ourselves, one that will limit our relationships, that will limit our capacity to be fully alive as a man or woman, a lie that will limit our ability to walk in freedom and sexual integrity. And he does it through trying to get us to believe something that's not true about ourselves. Here's one final example of that. I met a husband and wife several years ago now, and who they were walking through a very difficult time in their marriage. And at one point, as we were kind of talking through what was happening for them, one of them described how they just weren't sure that they were in the right marriage. And I asked about that. What do you mean that you're not sure you're in the right marriage? What does that mean? And they explained that they had actually always kind of imagined they would be in a different type of marriage, that God had designed them to be married to someone different than his wife. Well, you can imagine how destructive that idea is. I mean, it would be like, carrying nuclear waste inside your shirt. Just would erode at any of your ability or your endurance or your commitment to remaining faithful and working hard at the marriage that you're in. And so this idea that he had been designed by God for a different kind of marriage, but he had ended up in this kind of marriage, was incredibly destructive, not only for him, but for his wife and his children and his home. And so we had to really get after even some of the ideas of God's sovereignty and God's design and God's will, and where free will comes in, and all sorts of stuff like that. And all with the intention of really trying to free this guy from a faulty sense of his identity, a restrictive sense of his identity. Well, there are a lot of directions we can take this, but let me just spin a little bit here and turn to you and just ask you, what are the areas where you're struggling with habitual sin? And what might you be believing about yourself that's keeping you captive to that sin, or that's making it more difficult for you to walk in freedom from that sin? For example, were you sexually abused when you were younger? And did you believe or come underneath the lie that this is something you caused, something that was your fault, something that wouldn't have happened for you? I've talked to people who have been sexually abused once, and then because it felt good and they liked the attention, they went back and continued the relationship with that person. And because of that, they believed that this was something maybe the first time was abuse, but the rest was their doing, because they went back, without ever realizing that they had been groomed and manipulated to believe all of that, and that the pleasure they experienced was a hijacking of their bodies, and the value they placed and the attention they got from this person being significant and special to this person was that person misusing their need for attention, their hunger for a relationship, their hunger to be special. It wasn't just them going back. That's a misrepresentation. That's them coming under a lie about who they are. And so was that your experience? Does your experience relate with that? Likewise, was your experience something where you have begun looking at pornography at a young age or engaging in some other sexual behavior at a young age, and you just came to believe that this was something wrong about you, that, you were the one who was nosy and rooting through your uncle's house and found his porn. So you took the blame and have believed all along that you did something you shouldn't have done. And maybe you did, but I would also contend, how did you end up in your uncle's house alone and able to and how did you even suspect that there might be porn there? I mean, what were the breadcrumbs that were kind of left for you to end up discovering this at such a young age? And my point with that is not to point at your uncle or somebody else, but it's really to say, has the enemy of your soul gotten you to believe something about yourself through what happened there without you recognizing that you too were the victim of the enemy's manipulation and grooming to try to get you to continue to look at porn over and over again for all these years, when in truth, your heart has been longing for more? Or are you a man or woman who has experienced the same-sex attraction and believes that there's something chronically unique about you, that somehow you are uniquely different from every other man and woman because of this issue in your life? And I'm not negating that there are differences between the different areas of struggle or temptation that we experience, but are there ways that you've come underneath and your life has become smaller in your own perception of yourself, or that you've been limited in your relationships with other men or other women because you've seen this as something that is a distinctive about you that's more important than your common manhood or the common womanhood you share with others around you? And also your common Christianity, the reality that you are a part of the family of God, you are a daughter of God, you are a son of God, and you share that in common. And that actually is a stronger connection than anything else that's been keeping you away from others. And then finally, what about your marital status? What about your marriage? Are there things you've believed about yourself that have made your marriage harder for you than others? Things like, I'm not meant for a marriage like this. Or are you single and there are things you've believed about yourself as a single, that somehow being single makes you less valuable? And I know that a lot of singles hear those kinds of messages in the culture and the church, but if you bought and kind of, have you drunk down some of those lies about your identity, and it's keeping you stuck in a smaller life, as though your life's going to be less than others unless you're able to get married someday. So just some things to think about for you. If you recognize any of those false identities or ways that you've believed a false identity about yourself, then I want to encourage you just to pray with me something like this. Lord, I've believed that I'm less than I am, or I suspect that I've believed that I'm less than I am. I've become entrapped in a story that's not working for me to walk in integrity and wholeness and freedom. Lord, I want to know who you say I am. So would you expose the lies I've believed about myself? And would you help me to embrace who you say I am, even before I know and can see all the fruit of that in my life? Lord, I choose to believe you more than my experience, more than what others have said, and more than what I have declared about myself. And certainly, Lord, more than what the enemy has told me about myself. Lord, you are my creator, and who you say I am is who I am. Jesus, you are my redeemer, and who you've redeemed me to be is who I am. I say yes to the identity that you've given me and no to every other faulty identity. Lord, help me to walk in the newness of the life you've given me. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks for listening in. If you find the content of this podcast helpful, make sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts. That helps other people find the show. And if you'd like to check out more resources to help you in your journey towards becoming more whole, go to regenerationministries.org. Again, I'm Josh Glazer, and we'll see you next time.